Okay, so last time we met, we were looking at our good dead friend David Hume, talking about Hume stuff. And now we go on to more David Hume, talking about skepticism regarding the senses. Now, one of Hume's sort of trademark approaches is, unlike the thinkers like Descartes and Locke and so forth, who raise questions like, are there, in the case of Descartes, is there an external world? And how do we know about it if it does exist? Hume, as we saw, is taking the approach of, we need to figure out human nature. Then once we figure out human nature, then we can move on to address the other questions. And so in a way, he's doing a psychoanalysis of people, and as opposed to directly doing metaphysics or epistemology. And his hope was he could, once he figured out sort of how people work, he hoped he could move on to the problems of epistemology, metaphysics, etc. It's an interesting approach because with Descartes, his approach was, let's get right to the problems and how do we know there's an external world? And Hume is taking the approach of, well, let's figure out what's going on with humans, and then we can work from there. So his approach to skepticism starts off very different from Descartes. Descartes wants to prove certainty, and so he begins by being skeptical to try to find the undoubtable. Hume rejects the question right off the bat, which could be seen as a mistake, the question of do external objects exist or not? And he says it's vain to ask this question. The only question we can ask is a psychological one. What causes us to believe they're objects? To use an analogy, it'd be kind of like, think of someone who believes there are monsters in their closet. On one hand, of course, you might say, that's silly. On the other hand, you'd say, well, you wouldn't really ask the question, are there really monsters in the closet? Unless you're in a horror movie. Then yes, of course, they're there. You would not ask, are they really there? You would ask, why does this person believe this? A psychological question. And so Hume, right off the bat, seems to work from the assumption we can't actually answer that question. Are there objects? So they look at, why do we believe it? So it's kind of a psychoanalysis, like, so, why do you believe in monsters in your closet? Type of deal. Now, he believes one mistake people make when approaching this is they smush together two questions. And unlike peanut butter and chocolate, I guess they kind of go good together. He thinks they should be sort of kept separate. I guess kind of like peas and potatoes on the plate. I guess people have different views about plate food integrity, which could be a whole philosophy in itself. First question is this: why do we attribute continued existence to objects even when they're not present to our senses? So the first question is, to use a concrete example, when I'm not looking at the board, why do I think the board is still there, even when I'm not looking at it? The second question, which he thinks is a distinct question, is why do I suppose that objects exist apart from my mind and apart from perception? Now the questions, of course, do seem like kind of the same question, like why do I think the board is continuing even when I'm not sensing it? And the second one is, why do I suppose that it exists apart from my mind and perception? But those are actually two distinct questions, because one is essentially, why do I think they exist when I'm not looking at it, so to speak? And the other is, why do I suppose that it exists apart from my mind? Now, it does seem the questions do kind of smush together. How so? Well, here's the smush. If objects of the senses do exist unperceived, like so if I'm not looking at the board, it's still going, then we have to say, well, then that entails that it does exist independent of my mind and perception, because it's still there when I'm not perceiving it. And likewise, if their existence is independent from my mind and perception, then they will continue to exist. They'll continue to exist unperceived when I'm not looking at it, because it exists, continued and independent of my mind. So I think even though they're two separate questions, answering one answers the other. So in a way, it's kind of a twofer. If he can answer one question, the other one is resolved. I mean, to use like a bad analogy, even like if you have two teams playing, you know one team won, that answers the question of who lost. And even though who won answers the question of who lost, they're actually in a way different questions, even though they're closely related. And the one entails the other. In the case of the Yukon Huskies, they always win 4 years in a row. Pretty impressive. I would not want to play against them because I'm really bad, and they were just extraordinarily good. And I do not need more shade in my life. Now, he begins by thinking, well, addressing the question like, why do we believe this? Now, one thing he considers right away is maybe our senses do this. Maybe we somehow, through our senses, we believe objects exist unperceived. And when it comes to continued existence, he says, well, we can get rid of this right away. And the reason is this. Can our senses show to us that objects continue to exist when we're not sensing them? In other words, can I see an object existing when I'm not seeing it?
Before or at any time?
Oh, after, like take the board. When I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, it exists. And then, when I'm not looking at it, can my senses tell me the board still exists? No, because I'm not sensing it. It's essentially like asking, if you're not looking at it, are you looking at it? And the answer is no.
So is that innate, or like when a child or a baby sees the mother or parent going away, they think the mother's going away forever?
Yeah, it's a good point, because this actually, psychology actually ties in, modern psychology ties in pretty well here, because Hume is saying we don't get the idea in a sense of object permanence from looking at stuff. Because, like I said, the example, when the mother goes away, or the peekaboo thing, or when an object, because kids are really surprised when the object reappears, because they think that it's vanished. They find peekaboo endlessly fascinating. And Hume says, Hume would say this makes sense because our senses don't give us object permanence. Because if we're looking at it, it's there. When we're not looking at it, it's not. As far as I know, it's not there. So yeah, so if the baby can't see the mother, the baby has or hear the mother, the baby has no idea. The mother just doesn't exist as far as the baby is concerned in that way. And similarly for dogs who have separation anxiety. I can't see the owner does not exist. Well, dogs are philosophers. Actually, Plato said that. He said dogs are the most philosophical of animals because they love what they know and they hate what they don't know. And I had a dog that she would like to sleep. If you left a philosophy book on the floor, she'd sleep on it, just put her head on it. I assume she was absorbing the philosophy. But only philosophy books. Maybe because they were very thick and comfortable. It could be just the right size. Now, in the case of distinct existence, the same sort of thing. If I look at the board and I wonder, does the board exist distinct from my mind and perceptions? Well, my senses can't tell me that. But he thinks what we do is we infer kind of a double existence, that there's my perception of the board, and in fact the way we're talking about it is there's two things. There's my perception of the board and the board. But my senses can't tell me that the board continues, that exists apart from my mind, because it's kind of like similar to the first question. Can I see the board or not? I'm not seeing it. The answer is no. Does my perception of the board exist when I'm not perceiving it? Does it exist outside of my mind? And the answer is no, in that case. But we think it does. So he thinks we have a psychological problem, that our senses tell us nothing about this existing independently of us, continue to exist, yet we think that. And in fact, going back to your point about the mother, at a certain point kids develop the concept of object permanence. They think that it persists. And he was wondering, where does that come from? And it can't come from the senses because you never see it persisting you never see it when you're not seeing it. And so in a way he's trying to address that question. Why do we, at what point do we realize that when we're playing peekaboo, the person is still there? Now, he does consider, after saying consensus can't help us here, he does consider another approach, which is this. And it's kind of a reasonable one, namely, maybe the senses can, well, I guess the question is, are the senses deceiving us? And are they representing to us perceptions as distinct, both external and independent? And where does this mistake come from? Now, one reason why we might think, going back to the question of why do we think this, that there are external stuff that exists independent of us, is that we would think, well, impressions appear exterior to, in my case, me. The board is, from my perception, my perspective, the board is outside of my mind. It seems like that. It seems like all the stuff is like in here, out there. But he thinks that, even though that's kind of a clever response, like, well, why do you think this stuff exists independent of you? It's like, well, it's not in my head. It's out there. But he says there are 3 reasons why this doesn't work. Reason 1. It's a kind of a clever response. He says, we don't actually perceive our body. We think we do, but we don't. What we actually do is we only have sensory impressions. So, kind of the problem he's considering is this. Because we kind of think, well, in a way we're kind of thinking of it from like a third-person perspective. That you're looking at the world, and you put your hand up there and you see, okay, I'm looking at my body kind of like third-person perspective, and I can see this is not part of me, so this is outside of my mind. It's out there. I can see the boundaries of me. Stuff's out there. That's this me, that not me. So objects exist apart from my mind. But he says, but we don't actually experience that. We don't get the third person, to use my terminology, the third person perspective. You don't get out of yourself and say, aha, there's me, there's the object, okay, they're not part of me. And what he means is essentially that what we have is not this third person perspective where we see like ourselves and the object as distinct. We just have our impressions and then more impressions. So what I mean by being outside of ourselves, it's just a slightly different impression. And even though Hume didn't know about like video games or virtual reality, you can use the example of dreams. Because like when you're dreaming, it's as if stuff is outside of you. But we believe that dreams are just all in our mind because they're dreams. So it'd be like in a dream saying, okay, I know this stuff is real, but I'm dreaming, and it exists independently of me because my dream hand is distinct from it. But still, it's all in my mind. Or to go with like the virtual reality example, if you're plugged into virtual reality, and I mean real virtual reality, not like just virtual visual reality, it would seem like you get your virtual hand and virtual stuff, but of course, in that case, we'd know that none of it is external. It's all just occurring in your mind. And so Hume seems to be right. The fact that I'm looking at my hand and looking at the desk doesn't tell me that all of this could just be in my mind. I mean, I could say it's true. From my perspective, that's not part of like this, but I don't know if that's out there. It could just all be in my mind. And so it says, no. Second, he gives an example of sounds, taste, and smells. We take those to be, intuitively to be continued, independent existences or qualities. But, he claims, they don't appear to be like extended. They're not like 3-dimensional, or so he claims. So he claims they can't appear to our senses as external to the body. Now, what he seems to be saying here is this, that if we take, suppose for example someone says, well, I bite into an apple, I taste the apple. I see the color of the apple, etc., so it's out there. But Hume says, well, this doesn't tell me they're out there. It doesn't tell me they have this like 3-dimensional extension, or so he claims. And so he says, that doesn't work. His third one is one he probably borrowed or stole, because he didn't credit Berkeley, for Berkeley. And it's a problem with distance. Now, and this can be, like all these can be debated. He says, correctly it turns out, from the experiments I mentioned previously, is that sight doesn't give us distance. So when we, and one thing that proves this nicely is the examples I gave before. There are people who have been blind, from birth, and they did the operation as part of an experiment. But we can give you your sight if you want to participate in our experiment. What choice do I have? Thank you, Western scientists. And they found that people didn't get distance. I mean, they understood distance with their eyes closed. They learned that, but when they learned sight, they didn't understand distance. They had to learn that. And it's actually probably harder for them because as a kid, you just kind of adapt into it, and as an adult, you're like, oh. And so he seems to be right. We don't actually see distance, perceive it. We reason distance. We're doing subconsciously like all these mental calculations based on our experience about how far away things are. And this is nicely shown by how we can be deceived by optical illusions. Like, one of the ones, the classic ones, is where they have the kind of like the funhouse thing where they have the house where they do the proportions right. So as you walk back, it looks like you're getting bigger because everything is getting actually smaller. And so what it is it's set up kind of like this, but they did such a clever job, it looks like the person is growing. And then the reason why it's so weird is because it looks like they're, because our conditioning is that as things get smaller, they're further away, but they're shrinking, unusually rapidly because of the way it's designed. So it looks like the person's growing. So it kind of messes with us. And it's a good illustration that it does involve that reasoning. If we just saw distance and size just as they were, that wouldn't trick us. We wouldn't be fooled by those sorts of illusions. So Hume says that all this proves that our going by our self, it doesn't prove there's stuff out there. So he thinks that approach to reasoning, although initially appealing, there's stuff out there because it's not, here are my boundaries, it's outside my boundaries, so there's stuff out there. He says, nope, none of that works. So is that convincing? Could your laptop just be in your mind? I know, especially if you paid for it. You could have just thought it up, saved a lot of money. Of course, the money's not out there either, so I guess that's no problem. Yeah, I mean, we think this stuff's out there, as he says, but none of this actually proves that it's out there. Now, Hume then turns to talking about philosophers and the vulgar. And it doesn't mean people who swear a lot. It means, it's kind of a disparaging term that he uses for the masses, the many, the common folk. And what he does in the distinction between the two is shows how they look at the three categories differently. And here are the three categories. The first are what we saw were called by philosophers the primary qualities. Things like figure, shape, bulk, motion, and solidity. And these are what we normally call the primary qualities. And Hume says that both the philosophers and the vulgar, if you were to ask somebody, where is the mass of the desk, or is the solid object, out there? And philosophers and everyone would say, yeah, that's not, the desk is not in your head. The second category are what the philosophers call the secondary qualities, things like color, taste, smell. And Hume says that the philosophers say those are in your mind. But he says the vulgar, the common sense view, is that those are out there. Now, is he right about that? Well, if you were to go and talk to, say, like a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, someone who can use language, and you say, point to the color, they would point to, the object. They wouldn't say color, unless they were corrupted by science. In philosophy, they wouldn't say, well, color is just in the mind. Yeah, so intuitively, before we get exposed to philosophy, we in science, we think that color, taste, and stuff is out there. That, the world has color in it. It's got, the food has the taste in it, and, sound, etc. But of course, once we get exposed to science and philosophy, we get the view that those things are in our mind. Color is just in your mind. Taste is in your mind. The third category are pleasures and pains. Now, if you ask people, commonsensically, where is pain? Do they think that pain's in the, if someone like steps on a tack, do they say the pain is in the tack? No, pain is in them. So the philosophers and the vulgar both agree that pain and pleasure are in the mind. So this leads to conflicting views, because the philosophic system, at least the one Hume is representational realism he's going after, and the standard scientific view takes primary qualities to be out there for real in the world, the secondary qualities are in your mind, and pleasure and pain caused by these qualities, either being stepping on a tack, or tasting something really awful or really good, that those things are in the mind. So mind, out there, but for the vulgar, out there, mind. And he says then there's two conflicting views. Now, before people are corrupted by philosophy and science, they think that color and sound are out there. They say, where's the sound coming from? Someone's not going to say, unless they're hearing things, they don't say, well, it's in my mind, of course. They'd say it's over, the sound is coming from the engine or the speakers. Now, the reason Hume thinks that we think this not based on reason is because, well, do most people know the philosophical arguments about, for independent objects? And as Hume notes, perhaps kind of elitist, like, he says, well, these sorts of arguments from philosophers are not known to most people, and certainly not known to children or peasants, unless they're very corrupt, educated peasants. So we end up with contrary conclusions. The philosophical system is that everything that appears to the mind is something that is interrupted and dependent, perceptions. For the vulgar, that everything is, the perceptions are continued and independent. So, roughly speaking, this is sort of the problem going on. The representational realism, the philosophical system he's talking about, says, yeah, perceptions are not continued, they don't exist apart from the mind, they're in the mind. Whereas for the vulgar, even though there is a term perception, they would say that their color, taste, and so forth is real, is out there. So we end up with this conflict between what you might call common sense and representational realism. So how is he going to resolve it? Well, by lots and lots of words. First, he considers imagination. Now, suppose that we try to solve this problem, and we take perceptions and their objects to be the same thing. To say, literally WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. The folder is my perception is the folder. It's not basically what we call direct or naive realism. Now, in that case, we can't infer the existence of objects from our perceptions. Why not? Well, because if objects are the perceptions, there's no separation. In fact, in a way, there's no need to infer the existence of one from the other, because if you think they're both the same thing, there's no need to do that. Now, also, if one accepts that, you can't use a cause and effect argument because, well, there's not two things. There's not a cause, because The philosophical view is, of course, perceptions are caused by objects, but if objects are perceptions, perceptions are objects, there's no distinction. So that reasoning is out. But if we say that our objects are not the same thing as our perceptions, the philosophical view that there's object and perception, he claims the problem there is this: we still can't do that. Why not? Well, the problem then is that we can't engage in this reasoning because we can't reason from one to the other. Why not? A cause and effect problem again. I mean, we now have two separate things, but here's the problem. As Hume notes, and he'll develop this more later, in order to have do cause and effect on his view, we have to have one thing followed by another. Like you take microwave popcorn, for the microwave, you apply heat, you get popcorn. So you have popcorn followed by heat gives you uncooked popcorn, followed by heat gives you cooked popcorn. So you have one thing followed by another. But if our perceptions are the objects, then we just experience the perception, we never experience the object. So we can't say that this causes this, because we never experience this causing that. We can't get outside of our perceptions. So basically, he creates a dilemma. If they're the same, you obviously can't make that inference because there's not two things. No cause and effect, given his view. And we can't say our perceptions are caused by the objects because they are one and the same. If we take them separate, he basically presents a skeptical argument. You can't do this because you can't get out of your mind and see that the object is causing your perception. So either way, do. So to use the correct philosophical terminology. So then, how do we do this stuff? Well, what he claims is this. Well, why do we think then that there's continued indistinct existence? Well, given his argument, either path we take, we can't get to that through reason. Reason tells us, nope, but no. So he thinks the only thing left is imagination. We're, to use a technical term, we're making crap up, basically. We imagine they continue to exist. Or so he claims. Now, is he right about that? Is that doomed? If we think that what we see is what we get, can we show that what's out there matches what's in here? Well, the problem is there's no out there or in here. It's just whatever, however that works. And we take them as separate, then we end up with a problem. Go to analogy we saw before from Berkeley. It's like having a painting, and you can never. The only way you can tell if it's of a person, you got to be able to see that person and compare them. But if you have a painting and you never see the person, you have no way of knowing if it's a painting of a person or just a painting. And so you could imagine, oh yes, this is of Sally, very nice person. She's the best person ever. She's making America great again. Thank you, Sally. Yeah, so he thinks we're just making stuff up. Now, he also considers Berkeley's argument. Because one problem Berkeley said, hey, it's all perceptions. And then the question is, so George, how do I tell the difference between hallucinating, want some, mixture of opioids and some other stuff, just seeing things. How do I distinguish between hallucinations and real stuff? And his answer is, his claim is that real stuff is vivid and voluntary, and hallucinations and dreams are, less vivid. Now, as Hume points out, does that work? Well, can pain be really vivid and involuntary? Or I guess I'll put it with, do you voluntarily choose, when you step on something, like a piece of glass and it cuts your foot open, do you say, yes, I choose to feel pain? Or if you have the option, you check, no pain, please. or no extreme pain. I mean, I guess you'd want to know when, it's kind of a good, interesting question people have raised. You know, pain is good because it tells us when we're damaged, so we don't keep like, you know, standing in the fire or walk on glass. But the question is, you know, why does it have to be like so bad? Why can't it be like, okay, you're hurt, but they just tell you, you know, it feels bad, but it doesn't become just crippling and annoying. But he was right, you know, pain can be both vivid, it can totally dominate, you know, a person's experience, and it's pretty involuntary. You don't have it, as far as you know, you don't have control over that. It'd be nice to have that switch. But yeah, so the vivid argument doesn't seem to work. At the very least, our pains and pleasures and passions, anger, rage, can be just as vivid or involuntary as things we think of as being out there. You know, a person's anger at, you know, say, America not being as great as it should be, or their anger at, you know, the 1% controlling everything, can be very strong and vivid, as vivid as they're seeing the deaths and wounds and so forth. But we don't think the vividness or involuntariness of their anger makes it a real object existing apart, like their anger is a real thing. Although maybe it does manifest as a person. That'd be kind of interesting. The manifestation of anger. But yeah, probably not. Although the movie, what was it? How was that movie? The picture one with the emotions. Inside Out? Is that it? Yeah, I mean they had the emotions characterized as, and they're still in the mind, they were characterized as people. I guess Hume would probably like that. They probably like Pixar movies. Just guessing. I guess it'd be kind of, you know, philosopher game. Which movies are philosophers like? I think Descartes would like The Matrix. So then, what sort of fires our imagination to imagine stuff? Well, he then moves on to more psychoanalysis, looking at the concepts of constancy, coherence, and cause and effect. Now, the trouble, he thinks, arises when philosophers reject the common sense view, because basically saying representational realism gets us into trouble, because representational realism is the view that here's your mind, here's the object, and you can perceive the object, and it creates an image that's of the object. And you know, that seems to be what science tells us is going on. But you know, as we saw with all the skeptics, they say, problem. You know, how do you make that work? And so the vulgar view, naive or direct realism, is rejected in favor of representational realism. And then the problem is, of course, how do we accept that there's objects out there that exist continued and distinct? In other words, he's going back to the question, why do we believe there's stuff out there when we're not thinking about it, and that they exist when we're not perceiving them? So outside of our mind, existing unperceived. Because you could actually have something that exists, I guess, unperceived, that, well, you can have something outside that has to be perceived. So when you look away, it ceases to exist. I guess that would be possible. Just don't look away, especially if it's your money. No, I looked away from my money and I'm poor now. Well, poorer. So he thinks, sorting this out, maybe we can try to do it by looking at the notion of constancy, coherence, and cause and effect. Now, constancy is this. It's something we notice about stuff. Namely, even when objects change, they do have a certain constancy. Namely, I mean, we can easily illustrate. Take an extra marker, you know, take it out, still looks the same. And so things, you know, if we take this roof, you go in the room, the door's there, the windows are there, and every time we come here, it's basically the same. So, I mean, there are of course some changes, like the desks move around a little bit, you know, that stopped working, etc. But we find a high degree of constancy. And he thinks this sort of motivates us to think that, you know, there's continued distinct existence because of that constancy. Also, coherence. even when stuff changes, things change in kind of a coherent manner. And he claims, that this leads us to attribute to, our experiences through constancy and coherence, that existence, that they continue to exist and are perceived, and they exist apart from our mind. But he thinks this, because he draws a distinction between the internal and external stuff. Take like our internal feelings, like happiness or sadness, anger, joy, etc. Do we ever think that like our anger exists when we're not angry? That, going back to the Inside Out example, do we think that our anger is kind of hangs out, waiting, on the couch, watching some Netflix and chilling, and until it's time to get into rage, and he throws down his iPad and says, I'm ready for some anger. No, we think our anger, when it's there, it's there. When it's not, it's gone. We don't think it has to keep on persisting. We don't have like stores of anger, or stores of happiness. But with external objects, we think of them as existing. Like when we leave this room, we think the stuff is still here, that it remains. Or like people, we think Trump is still around you, or looking at Trump, or Bernie, or Kasich, or Cruz, the last survivors. Now, to sort of illustrate this, he gives the Porter example, and which essentially shows kind of like how the thinking process goes as to why we believe there's this continued, distinct, independent existence. So he's in a scenario where he's in his room. A porter brings him a letter. And of course he thinks, well, if he has a letter from his friend, this shows there's a whole bunch of, he reasons, there must be a lot of other stuff going on. Because, well, the porter couldn't have just flown up here, so there had to be stairs. The letter had to come from, so you could say it's a letter from Ben Franklin. It had to go across the oceans, and the ocean had to be there. There had to be ships that carried it. There had to be America. There had to be Ben Franklin. There had to be a pen. And so we sort of reason or think that based on our experience, we think the world is out there, even when we're not perceiving it. So when you get a letter, you think, aha, there must be all this other stuff connected with the person who wrote the letter to me, which is natural to think. But what he needs to do, of course, is show how do we reason through that, and is this justified? And what he says is this: coherence. Now, reasoning from coherence, he thinks, is different from reasoning from cause and effect. How so? Well, badly drawn. Here's the difference. Now, with cause and effect, of course, we have to have, observing two things. What happens according to Hume is we observe one thing being followed by another over and over and over again, and then by habit, we say, aha, for example, boiling water, applying heat to water at 100 degrees centigrade causes it to boil. So we have to have, experience of both things. But he thinks the reasoning from coherence is different, because cause and effect is you gotta have those two things. Coherence is basically, well, coherence. It stays basically the same. You look at the marker, looking at it, look away, look back at it, and it's still basically the same. There's coherence in our experiences. So we think that our experiences are having coherence, so we infer that the marker, for example, is continuing to exist. And it's different with cause and effect, because cause and effect would be you see your marker, well, you have the object, and you see your perception, and you see the connection. But we can't do that. With coherence, it's, well, things are staying basically the same, so I'm guessing it's the same thing. And he thinks that that's different reasoning. So the regularity of perceptions ends up just being, well, it's also a form of habit. Like we see, if you look around the room, here day after day, and it looks basically the same every time. So you'd say, yeah, same room, it's been persisting when I've been looking at it through that habit. But he thinks we can't use this. We can't go from my perceptions, have regularity. The room looks basically the same every time I'm here, to the object being regular. So what does he mean by that? Well, essentially what he's saying is this. If every time you come to the room, it looks basically the same, desk, chair, blah, 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 windows, what we're doing is, according to Hume, is regularity of perceptions. You'd say, well, here's my perception of the room now, here's my memory of my perception of it from last class, and 2 weeks ago, and I note that these perceptions are all pretty regular. But he says that's very different from saying there's an object that's been existing independently of our perceptions. To use an analogy, it would be kind of like using the virtual reality one, like going to a virtual room and saying, yeah, looks similar, looks similar, looks similar, or having a dream. A dream would be a better one. Some people have like recurring dreams. There's a place you go to. Weird that I used to have one where there's a restaurant. For some reason, when I dream, I can always go to that restaurant. And the food's pretty good. So I try to go there as often as possible. And of course it is, it has the same menu, the same people working there. Actually get older, it's kind of weird. It's like a really apparently put a lot of effort into that. I guess because the food's so good. But does that show that the restaurant is actually existing? That there's a restaurant in my mind? No. So regularity of perception, he thinks, doesn't show that there's a regularity of the object, or so he claims, which does seem true. So then there is still an interesting question: how then do we get to the notion of object permanence, which is essentially the object exists when we're not perceiving? So here is sort of his next stab at trying to work this out. He thinks it's a combination of imagination and coherence. How so? Well, basically it works like this, according to him. He thinks that any reasoning about matters of fact is going to be a matter of custom, habituation. And custom is always a matter of repetition. So, if we are extending, custom and reason beyond our perceptions, which we'd have to do to say there's, stuff existing unperceived, et cetera, it must be different from repetition. So what he thinks basically, here's his analysis. This is how it goes. As drawn by this, badly drawn diagram. And we can also show it with like an actual object. So what he thinks that we do is this. We have the perception of the dry erase marker. And then, you blink. Or like it goes out of sight. And then it returns. Now, of course, we don't see that it's the same, because we don't see it's, for all you know, maybe I got an identical one and just magic tricked it with my magic skills, which I did not, because I tried that once and I was just dropping it and just run the whole thing. It just looks stupid. So I'll leave the magic to the magicians. Or did I? That's magic, you don't know. So, yeah, when it goes out of sight, what we do is this. Here's the original marker, and then it goes out of sight, and then what appears to be the same thing returns. Now, since we don't experience it when it's out of sight, we have no way of knowing that it's the same thing. And reason, of course, according to Hume, can't tell us that it's the same thing, because he thinks that we can only reason from cause and effect, habit, etc., but he's an empiricist. So literally, since we can't experience it, that's essentially just a zone of not, we don't know. So given that he's an empiricist, the only thing that can connect it is imagination. So we imagine that it persists. So what we're sort of thinking is, you see it, now you don't, now you think you do, that you say, well, okay, I saw it here, and it looks like the same here, couldn't see it then, so I imagine it's the same thing. So essentially it's just our imagination fills in the gap psychologically. So going back to object persistence, apparently at a certain point the child's mind gets the condition that it imagines that the object is still going. Now, one hand, of course, it seems a bit, kind of silly, like, yeah, sure, we know that we can't see it, it's still there. But then a fair question would be, well, how do you really know? How would you prove it? You say, well, I can go and look. And you say, well, yeah, you can go and look, and when you're looking at it, you're looking at it. But how do you know it's still there when you're not looking at it? Now, by itself, of course, coherency is not enough to support continued existence. Because if it's similar but different, if I put this behind my back and came out with one that looked kind of similar but a little different, you might think, well, maybe that's not the same thing. Maybe it's, it's a slightly different one. To use another analogy, like if you see somebody, and you see someone that looks a lot like them, like a couple of years later, you're not entirely confident it's the same person. You have to try to confirm it. So by itself, he thinks coherence is not enough. So what we need is constancy. So he thinks if we blend together constancy and coherence, then we come up with the idea of continued existence. So what we do basically is this. Kind of like that, except a little more stuff going on. So we regard, well, going back to this example of the extra stuff, we have that interruption. You blink, look away or something, and you wonder, is that still the same thing? And what we tend to do is, well, the interruption is contrary to their identity, because as long as we're looking at it, we know we're looking at the same thing. But then if we look away and look back, how do we know it's not been replaced with an exact duplicate? Well, what we think is, at least according to Hume, is that to avoid the contradiction, since we have the first perception, then the second perception, and we know the perception, we believe the perceptions are not identical, we get the idea, or develop the idea, that the perceptions are connected, that there is behind them a real existence. So, at least according to him, when our perceptions are broken, but they cohere and they're constant, you look at the camera, look away, look back at the camera, well, the camera's looking at us. That what we do is say, yeah, it's the same camera, because the constancy and coherence we think is a continued existence. Even when I'm not perceiving the camera's still there. So, this shows the link between the principles of continued existence, that is to say it exists when it's not perceived, and a distinct existence, that it exists outside of our minds. So once we establish continued existence, he claims what follows is distinct existence. So the camera's existing when I'm not looking at it, that entails that it exists apart from my mind. And so we think the camera is out there. But we're not justified by this. Why not? Well, this is what he claims. Believing that our perceptions exist, unperceived, is contrary to plainest experience. Now, to prove this, he engages in some experiments. One he tried is this: badly drawn, if you apply a little bit, just a little bit, not too much, otherwise you pop your eyeball, that would be bad. You do this, images double. And as Hume points out, do we think that if we put like our money, if you put your money on the table and do this, you just double your money? Ooh, I'm rich. No. So what does he think that proves? Well, he claims even though we have a perception of, say, you can double things just by pushing this, we don't think there's now two things. And we don't think that that it is a continued independent existence. And so many reasons, if we don't think that the double perceptions have existence, why think the single one has existence either? Or so he claims, which is kind of clever. Now he goes through and basically grinds through the usual suspects, kind of the standard arguments for the relativity. For example, objects seeming to shrink and grow, in the distance. On one hand, we think, well, they're not shrinking or growing, but they certainly look that way. Also, changes in color from illness, or changes of taste from illness. And so he thinks that all this stuff shows that our perceptions do not exist independent, that they exist within us, they don't exist out there. So, he says essentially, so much for that. But he still keeps going. So, getting back to the philosophical and vulgar systems, this is what he says. And this is what he means by the philosophical system, again, is representational realism. Get the idea in your mind, supposedly there's stuff out there. Now, philosophers, at least in this particular system he's talking about, distinguish between the stuff out there and our perceptions. The perceptions, they claim, are interrupted, perishing, changing constantly in our head. The objects are continuing, persisting, and are out there. Now, Hume claims that basically the philosophical system is basically a drug that people take to deal with. It's like Jack Daniels, telling people to do to get through the day. Literally, he thinks that it's a palliative remedy, basically, an attempt to deal with this insoluble problem. And he claims that the only influence it has, it gets all from the vulgar. So basically saying essentially it's, a drug, and the only real power it has comes from the vulgar system. So how does he argue for that? Well, his argument for the first part is this. As we saw before, according to Hume at least, the only way you can know something exists, he claims, is by cause and effect. And that requires observing, A causing B, or observing, A and B conjoined over and over again. But of course, as we've seen, past skeptical arguments, can you get outside of your mind? Can you see your mind and what you're perceiving? No. So, as he sees it, there's no, again, this is sort of rehashing a classic argument, there's no way you can get outside of your mind to see, well, here's my mind, here's the perception, here's the object. So, check. We can't do that. And so, we can never make that connection. So he claims that basically, when we tell ourselves, representational realism, it's, we're drugging ourselves. We're delusional. So he claims. Which takes us to the second part, namely that it's the vulgar that has the influence. And his answer is pretty straightforward. Since the philosophical system has nothing going for it, it's total BS, if it has any power whatsoever, it's going to come from the vulgar. To use an analogy, it's kind of like, it's like there used to be these things called patent medicines, or sometimes now known as snake oil. And they had one that supposedly cured people's ills. And they found, later examining them, the ingredients were typically just had no effect, except for one. It would have alcohol or cocaine in it. And so you'd say, well, if you have Dr. Smith's, patented, medicine, and you find out it's like water, sugar, and cocaine, then you know that whatever effect it had doesn't come from the water and sugar, it's got to be from the cocaine. So likewise, if you have a sweet blend of philosophy and vulgar, and the philosophy is basically just water, and the vulgar is like cocaine, you know it's all coming from the vulgar. The philosophical reasons are interrupted. Now, this, of course, accepting the philosophical system does end up in some sort of psychological disorder. Here's how. Our imagination, he thinks, works like this. First, if we're a representational realist, we say, well, the only thing we're aware of is our perceptions. That's all we get going on. Resembling perceptions are the same, however interrupted they appear. So I get a perception of the camera, and no matter how much I interrupt it, it's still the same perception over and over. But the interruption is contrary to the identity, because when I'm not looking at it, it seems like the perception is gone. There are gaps. So there seem to be, holes in the object, so to speak. So, what we delude ourselves into thinking is that somehow the perception is existing unperceived. So in these gaps where we're not perceiving, we think somehow the perception keeps on going. But as Hume notes, this is just total BS. Why? Well, we accept that perceptions are dependent on our mind. So just like Berkeley argued, if we're not perceiving them, they're not there. So you can't say perceptions are existing and perceived because they can't do that. So basically it's delusional. So what ends up happening? Well, Hume says this. While philosophers reject the continued and independent existence of perceptions, only skeptics reject their continued existence. Any claim that skeptics really don't believe their view. So what he's essentially saying is that while we think that perceptions don't exist independent, we do think they keep existing even when we don't perceive them, which of course is a mess. So the mess ends up being basically this. First, he claims that what happens is reason leads us into a bad place. Because, we get sucked into this representational realism, we're like, yeah, we have ideas in our mind, there are about objects out there, we have representations of these ideas, that's all cool and stuff. But he says, our natural inclination is to believe that what we see is what we get, naive or direct realism. And so what we do is we come up with this, basically this drug. We say, we have a double existence. You got objects, you got perceptions, the objects exist unperceived, they're continued, the perceptions in our mind, they're discontinued, they're interrupted, etc. And so we got this double system. But he says this is a monster. How so? Well, our imagination leads us to think our perceptions keep on existing, continued and uninterrupted. So the camera is there, my perception is there whether I'm looking or not. Imagination. The reason tells me, hey, that's not the case. I'm not looking at it, my perception is gone. And so he created a new fiction, namely, got perceptions in the mind, and they are interrupted and so forth, and then you get the objects out there. So, representational realism. But as he says, if we really believed that our perceptions, if we believed in the naive realism, what you see is what you get, we wouldn't have that double existence. Again, going back to like a 5-year-old, you ask them, where's the color? They'd say, hey. And so they have no problem. They don't think there's, idea in their head and thing out there. They think of it as like what they see is what they get. So at that point, we would need this weird system. And if we believed that the perceptions didn't exist, independently, continued, blah, 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 then we think we wouldn't need a double system either. We think everything is just, like Berkeley did. We'd have Berkeley system. And so Hume says, essentially, his argument is, we can either be naive realists or idealists, but we're trying to be both, right? We're trying to, in a way, both systems. That you get objects out there, you have perceptions, and he says, maybe kind of on his view, that either you've got to be just what you see is what you get, or you've got to be an idealist like Berkeley, where it's just, to be is to be perceived. Now, he does think that it's a good drug, because we're able to basically deceive ourselves. I mean, it's kind of like alcohol. I'm looking good. Type of deal. She's looking good. Type of thing. We're all looking good. I can drive really well. And so it allows us to deceive ourselves. We can say, okay, it's like the vulgar system, so we can use our reason and say, okay, this is cool. But then we can easily slide back to our natural inclinations. So what's his end result? Well, end result is this. We basically are engaged in deception. We suppose what's up there resembles what's in here, but as he said, we have no justification for that. We just kind of think it. Where does it come from? Imagination, roughly put. We're making that up. Because he thinks all we've got in our mind is perceptions. Secondly, we assume that the stuff out there resembles what's in here. But, he says, this is all imagination too. We just throw in resemblance, and then we just tell ourselves, okay, stuff out there, stuff in here, they're connected. And Hume says, this is all just, again, delusion, essentially. We're just drugging ourselves with this, this philosophical drug. So what's his ultimate conclusion? Well, it basically comes down to this. It's all essentially illusion. And so we try to solve the problem by making up stuff. It doesn't work. And so he ends up saying, well, the following. First, skeptical doubt is something he regards as, well, essentially an illness. It can never be radically cured, because there's no way, he claims, to defend our understanding, representational realism, that's indefensible, nor can we defend our senses. So essentially he says, there's no support for either of those. So what we're essentially doing is, again, just drugging ourselves. So it's like a person who's got a problem, it's like, I'll just, drink some more. That will solve my problem. So he thinks the end result is, he can't trust his senses, he can't know that there's stuff out there. So he ends up kind of like a Descartes' skeptical nightmare. But this is what he claims. There's a fix. Here's the fix. If you really think about it, this situation, you end up in skepticism. Because you say, okay, I've got ideas of stuff, I think there's stuff out there, but there's no way it's possible to prove that. So I don't know if there's anything out there. Scary skepticism. So what's the cure? Well, the cure, as he claims, is this. We think about it too much, and that leads to trouble. Solution, stop thinking about it so much. And he says the remedy, the cure, is just don't think about it. He says, even though he sort of reasoned himself into a mess, I don't know if there's anything out there, he essentially says, an hour after he finishes this, when he's down at the pub drinking with his friends, playing darts, he won't care anymore. So, problem, we have no way of disproving an external world. And he's gone through all the options he thinks they're there. He thinks it's all basically a psychological deception and delusion, and the only rational conclusion is total skepticism. You have no idea. But eventually, if you don't think about it, you'll be fine. So don't think about it, everything will be okay. That's Hume's advice. So after all that work, we ended up where we started. Don't worry about it, it'll be okay.
So we should have skipped the lesson.
Should have skipped it. Yep, so wait, hour 50 minutes of your life wasted. Okay, so next time, in our next time wasting adventure, we'll go on to looking at personal identity and what we are. So, have a good rest of the day, and see you next week in the future.